Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Sci-Fi Pulsi. So today we're going to talk about the War of the Ring and Sauron. So I'm just going to say up front, I'm not a Lord of the Rings expert in the same way I am for something else like Star Wars or A Song of Ice and Fire, Dune or Evangelion. So I might get some details wrong, but I did do some research for this, and I did talk to a couple friends of mine who are experts on this sort of thing. So let's start out by talking about Sauron. So to me, what makes Sauron such an interesting villain is despite being a Maiar, a fire spirit, all these kind of things, he really, at least in the books and the movies, lacks a kind of like 40 chess, 1,000 year long plan to cure the common cold. Now, my understanding, I haven't read the prequels or anything, but Morgoth, his master, tried to win through plans like that, through like making giant monsters or having like these excessively complicated spells or something like that. And with Sauron, we don't really see that. We see someone who's a lot more rational, a lot more calculating, and kind of has more of, I guess you could say, a scientific approach to war than we see with a lot of fantasy villains, especially someone who's like a disembodied spirit like Sauron. He's really not the kind of figure that you would expect to take this approach. So let's just kind of break it down. Let's talk about what Sauron's plan was, why it was brilliant, and why it probably would have worked if it wasn't for those meddling hobbits. So, my understanding of what the One Ring does is it prevents Sauron from losing his magical strength in the same way that the other beings of Middle Earth do. Because my understanding is magic's going out of the world, more and more of the elves are leaving, the various magical creatures are dying out or becoming mundane. But because of the ring, Sauron does not lose any of his power as time goes on. So automatically that gives him a huge edge because it means that he will remain the most powerful magical being in Middle Earth, and this advantage will only grow over time. And we'll see this a lot with Sauron, that he has a lot of really good long-term plans, but not 4D chess plans. So as we know, during the War of the Last Alliance, he got beaten by Isildur and Elrond, and Isildur took the One Ring. Now, what's interesting is Sauron put a failsafe into the One Ring, where, from my understanding, it's actually impossible to destroy. That is, regardless of how strong the will of the person is, they're not capable of throwing it into Mount Doom. And once again, this is a brilliant strategy because so long as the One Ring exists, Sauron will cling to this world and will maintain some form of power. Like, he lost a lot of strength when Isildur attacked him, but he was still alive. And as we'll see later on, he was able to come back and continue his plans on, more or less unhindered. But yeah, so it's impossible to destroy the One Ring. In the end, it was basically a fluke that destroyed it. But it doesn't matter how strong the will of the person is. It doesn't matter what their intentions are. It's impossible to destroy. So shortly after the War of the Last Alliance, Isildur died and the One Ring was lost. Now, from my understanding of how Sauron viewed this was not ideal, but this was still a good outcome. Because he's immortal as long as the One Ring's gone, is still in existence. So if the One Ring is like at the bottom of the ocean or buried under a bunch of mud, it's not as good as if he had it, but it basically means it won't get in the way of his plans. It's the only thing that can possibly stop him at this point. And Gandalf even says the enemy thought that it was destroyed or lost and had kind of given up on it. I think in the movies, from my understanding, what my friends tell me, Sauron's a lot more reliant on trying to get the ring back and win through kind of a bit more of a Wile E. Coyote, like super magical plan. But he had kind of accepted that it was gone, and his war plans really had nothing to do with the One Ring. So another one of Sauron's long-term projects that's interesting is, from my understanding, he was a Promethean figure that he went to a lot of the other peoples of Middle-earth, not the free men of Middle-earth that we see, but the other parts of the continent. And he was kind of a Promethean figure. He taught them like how to read, how to write, how to build cities, metallurgy, all this kind of stuff. And my personal view, I don't know if this is in the canon at all, but that the the Nazgul, were kings of these various states that he uplifted, and that was part of the way he took over them. But Sauron is regarded as a god king in much of Middle Earth, and this furnishes him with a limitless stream of human soldiers. As we'll talk about a bit later, human soldiers are much, much better than orcs, because orcs can't hold formation, orcs are cowardly, orcs are much weaker than men. So this would prove to be a very good investment, because you have orcs as just cannon fodder, but then you have your better troops, like Uruk-hai and humans, who can come in behind once the enemy is broken out of formation and they're just slaughtering orcs. But anyways, in the interbellum between the War of the Ring and the War of the Last Alliance, Mordor had gotten completely wrecked, his castle destroyed, but Sauron eventually was able to pull himself together and started to rebuild. Rebuilding his hold on the other kingdoms, rebuilding the orcs, rebuilding the infrastructure in Mordor. And it seems to me like his plan was basically to just kind of wait them out. He was getting stronger all the time. He was recruiting more and more people from his vassal kingdoms. He was building more siege weapons and that kind of thing. He was breeding more and more orcs. Meanwhile, all the other major powers in Middle-earth were in decline. My understanding is Gondor wasn't in like terminal decline, but they had been declining over time without strong kings to rule over them. I'm not sure exactly what was happening in Rohan, but they don't appear to be nearly as militarily strong as Gondor or Mordor is. You also have a lot of his old nemesis, particularly the elves, getting weaker and more of them leaving. So in essence, he just kind of has to wait out the clock. As I said, as long as the One Ring is still in existence, he's completely immortal, and he has all the time in the world. So the longer he waits, the more soldiers he gets together, the more ready he is, and the weaker his opponents are. So the question is, why does he decide to launch the War of the Ring if things are going in his direction anyways? Why do this big attack? Why basically try to Zerg rush them? Now, from my understanding, Aragorn could have used the One Ring perhaps for the rest of his life. Because his inherent goodness, his strong will, and his descent from Numenor would have allowed him to use it for quite a while. And he would have been able to, I guess kind of like Isildur, used it to rally the various peoples of Middle-earth together, and using the power of the ring lead them to defeat Sauron again. And once again, this doesn't mean Sauron would die, but he didn't really want to take another 1,000 years to rebuild his army again. I mean, he's patient, but he's not that patient. And the idea of Aragorn getting the ring terrified him. So he preemptively launched his war when he wasn't entirely in position and split his forces up and attacked a whole bunch of different areas. Because his idea was, okay, we have to just destroy the enemy's military in resources before Aragorn can get the ring and can start leading them. So, because if we devastate Gondor, we devastate Rohan, it doesn't matter if he has the ring or not. There's not going to be anything to rally. There's not going to be a coalition army that's going to show up and stop me and rally around him. He'll just be one man with a small number of people in the ring. Also, once again, Sauron's soldiers are very easy to replace. He can always just breed more orcs or recruit more people from more levies from the various other kingdoms under his vassalage. Whereas Gondor is, I believe, in a population decline, and its military isn't really getting any stronger. And Sauron's strategy, I think, is pretty much completely successful. Like, if we look at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, it's technically a coalition victory in that they took the field and they relieved the siege. The issue is they took horrific casualties. But it was ultimately a disaster. They lost a huge number of men. They lost a lot of Rohirrim. They lost a lot of Gondorian soldiers. And while they destroyed one of Sauron's field armies, he had plenty more people to draw upon. Now, as kind of a side note, one of the all-time coolest sayings a friend of mine had was, to describe the Pelennor Fields, was, while the orcs fled, Sauron's human servants chose to die for their god. And my understanding is pretty much all of his human soldiers died in that battle because they stood firm because they worshipped Sauron, which is very, very useful. Because as I said, orcs are cowardly. Orcs just run away in a lot of cases if it's near even numbers, whereas his human soldiers would stand to fight. So, to me, this is a great victory for Sauron. He has achieved his kind of mission goal. He's devastated the coalition armies. He's going to have to put another field army together, but things are going pretty good for him. Basically, at this point in time, his victory, if a conventional war goes on, is inevitable. He's destroyed a lot of the remaining military power of the coalition against him. I'd like to point out once again, none of these plans have anything to do with the One Ring. I mean, he's kind of motivated to do this because he's scared Aragorn's going to get the ring and he's going to use it to fight him. But he's attempting to win with his armies. He's attempting to win with his soldiers. He's not focused on doing some giant spell or creating super dragons or super soldiers. Well, I mean, actually, Saruman's super soldiers were a good idea. But once again, that was kind of a conventional army. And that's kind of what's so fascinating about him, that he was willing to win through conventional means, and the fact that it largely worked, and it was basically only a fluke that wound up stopping him in the end. Like, the invasion of Mordor was an act of desperation. They were all going to get killed if Frodo hadn't have... Well, if Smeagol hadn't have dropped the ring into Mount Doom. So that basically, I guess, kind of sums up my thoughts on Sauron and the War of the Ring. A very interesting villain, very different from a lot of fantasy villains that would kind of follow in his footsteps. It's something I really wish we could see more of. Less of this, like, human instrumentality project, 5,000 year long plan to cure the common cold. If anybody's wondering what that's a reference to, Nicol Boros, whatever his name is, the dragon planeswalker in Magic the Gathering, has like this literally like this 3,000 year long plan that no one understands. And someone on one of the forums said his 3,000 year long plan is to cure the common cold. And I just thought that was really funny and a really accurate description of a lot of these like cockamamie schemes. Anyways, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the video. Sci-Fi Pulsi is back. Expect more videos in the near future. God bless you all. This is Argent. We must ascend.